Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Here we are once again in Divine Ideas with Rafael Cabrera and Tritan,
That's
Rafael's
right.
friend, which is our new guest in our podcast today. He's doing psychiatry. He's trying to get his degree, and we will know a little bit more about him today. Rafael, how are you today?
Hey, what's up, Mario? How's it going? Well, we're here Sunday again, doing Ideas Divinas. And man, I'm really fine today. I went to the gym, I work out, I did a meal prep. And man, the day is fire today. We have our new guest, Tritan, which is a guy who met yesterday, I think, or on Friday on a club, and we started talking. And man, as soon as we meet each other, he started talking about he was studying medicine, and a question come to my mind. Divine idea. Hey, Peyton, how do you cure depression? What do you think is the best way to cure depression?
Depression?
And depression, exactly. And we start talking. Yeah, Creighton, what's up, man? How are you?
Great. Like I said before, thank you for having me on here. I'm super excited to talk to you guys. So I'm just I'm looking forward to the conversation over the next hour or so.
Yeah,
It's
cool.
cool.
So Triton, give us a little context about you, like where you go to college, how long have you been doing this, and where are you from, basically? And yeah, who
Yeah,
are you?
yes. So we obviously met, Rafael and I met in Seattle a couple days ago. I was visiting a friend. I'd been there before, but where I'm originally from is kind of western side of Pennsylvania, if you know Pittsburgh.
Right.
Um, and that's where I studied. So exactly, I'm still studying now, but basically my educational background was um, I went to university and did 4 years there. I did a lot of neuroscience, chemistry, biology, physics. My degree was in neuroscience, but also in creative writing, and I studied the humanities a lot as well there with some extra time that I had. And after those 4 years, I went to medical school, which I know in a lot of like other countries, medical school and the undergrad university are kind of a combined 6, 7 year thing.
Right.
So here it's 4 years and 4 years. I am currently in the third year of the medical school process. But I did take a standalone year of research where I worked um, with pediatric brain tumors and also kind of epilepsy in the brain. And for a
Okay.
while, I actually thought I was going to do something like brain surgery. However, there's a lot of things I found out about that kind of, they steered me away from that and back to my original plan of working with mental illness and psychiatry. And so now I do a lot of work, both clinically and some research work with that as well. And
Wow.
so in about another year, I'll finish my degree and I'll go on to be a psychiatrist. So I'm nearing the end.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot,
Oh,
man. You've done like a lot of stuff. So I'm curious, what took you back from doing brain surgery to go back to psychiatry?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's a question that a lot of people maybe don't consider initially because in the United States, and honestly everywhere in the world, like brain surgery is a flashy thing, right? It's really
Right.
cool. And it is an interesting field of work. You know, during my
yeah.
time, I was very grateful. I got to do brain surgery on animals for research. I got to do brain surgery on cadavers. I got to do brain surgery assisting, not the full thing, on actual patients. They can be beautiful surgeries. They can be life changing. But the reality of the field is that they're still very dangerous. A lot of people, unfortunately, do not benefit from these surgeries. And so the new kind of movement in this, field of science is that one, there used to be, I don't know, thousands of aneurysm clippings per year where they'd open the side of your head and they'd go and they'd take a little clip and they'd kind of clamp down on the blood vessel that was the problem. And that was very dangerous. In the last 10 years, that has decreased by 50%. And instead, they take a little tube and they go up one of your arteries, either in your hand or in your groin, and they
Wow.
actually use titanium to coil these now. And if you look across any type of brain surgery, these non invasive methods are actually taking over. And if you look at the history of medicine, a similar thing happened to cardiology. And
Oh,
the
really?
job market for cardiology, the cardiologists are actually doing more of the surgical work than the cardiothoracic surgeons in some regards. So one thing that drove me away was that a lot of the surgeries I was interested in, my mentors told me, hey, like in a couple years, these might not be performed routinely. And what is left in the field of neurosurgery is actually back surgery. And I'm just not particularly interested in back surgery. I like the brain. So I said, I
Right.
really like mental illness. I think it's an interesting disease. I think it's a thing that most people struggle with at some point in their life, and it's something that you can really make a difference in their life for. So that's kind of where I turned my viewpoint to.
Right. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
wow.
impressive.
Yeah, that's impressive. Really impressive. So let's start with the things you like. What is depression and why it does appears in the persons everywhere in the world?
Yeah, and I think like the question you ask here is, I figured you'd ask me this when we after we met on Friday, and so I was brainstorming. I think what I can give is a good idea for you, and I think sorry if
Okay.
this is a little long, but I think the best way to look at this stuff is to kind of go back into the past of like how depression has been viewed throughout life, right?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple hundred years ago, someone would tell you that depression, if you were walking around Europe and you said, I feel depressed, they'd tell you that your humors were out of balance and that one of the ways they could help you was to bloodlet you. And obviously that didn't work, right?
Yeah. Not
Putting
too.
a leash on someone isn't doing that. And for actually a while after that, people realized that wasn't working, and they actually turned to kind of a religious explanation for why depression was causing problems. They said, if you're sinning, you're not in line with like your relationship with God, then maybe this is why you have whatever it be, any mental illness. And that's like actually one of the drivers of like why the mental institution or the asylum became a thing. But of course, later we realized that that wasn't really a satisfying answer either. People who have never done anything wrong in their life or, live very pious lives still can have these problems. Um, and so you go until maybe the early 1900s, this idea that like Sigmund Freud came around and said, like, the unconscious mind is really where depression manifests. And this idea that, like, maybe unconscious desires that are not in line with how you live your life is a problem. That's a little bit better, but there's still a lot of things that he said, Sigmund Freud, that we don't believe today are realistically the drivers behind depression. And
All
as
right.
we, yeah, and I would say maybe later in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, there was really a huge emphasis in the entire world of medicine, but especially maybe the psychiatric world, where people said, it's time for science to really answer these problems, and like all this kind of like quack social theory should go to the back seat. And so that's where you maybe hear the idea of like the serotonin hypothesis of depression, where you have too little serotonin, and so that's what's making you sad. And so they would give you, say, Prozac, they would give you some other SSRI, and that would make you better. The problem is, while these medications can work, people benefit from them, they don't solve the problem for everyone. And someone
Yeah.
really pointed out, and this is actually some of what my research looked at when I was an undergrad, you would take an SSRI, the medication for depression. It would increase the chemical that was supposed to be making you depressed when there was not enough of it, the serotonin. And even though your serotonin would go up immediately, you wouldn't feel better for a couple of weeks. So people said, hey, we put the chemical back, it's back in normal levels. Why aren't you feeling better? Obviously, something
Right.
else has to be amiss here. And
Yeah.
so yeah, they said it can't just be serotonin. Even if these medications help, it can't just be serotonin. And so I think at least what I believe and what the modern medical field believes is that kind of depression is really a much more complicated thing. It's not like when you have diabetes and you go to the doctor and they give you insulin or some medication, you can control it. It's more complicated than that because what makes a person depressed, right? It can be anything. Some people
Yeah.
might some people might be predisposed. They're just sad people. And then, that might be where medications help a little more. Some
Right.
people like you have a tragedy in your life or your life's not going well. That can make you depressed. Are those the same things? It's hard to say. But I think what you could really isolate as a common thread throughout all of depression is that if your social life isn't going well, if your you know, kind of uh, directionality in life, your purpose is what I said on Friday, is not in line with where you want it to be, you're probably more likely to face depression. And whether you need some sort of actual medical aid or you just need therapy or you need like, some life coaching, that's that could depend person to person. But I think anyone who is not kind of satisfied in their current position is going to be at risk for depression. And so we really can't ignore the social side of depression in favor of a wholly biological one, if that makes sense.
Right, 100%. Yeah, I agree.
Wow.
Uh, I agree widely to what you're saying, but I will maybe add another point, like not just because the social life can be one of the reasons, but I also, for instance, can feel more sad if I'm eating junk food, like for a good amount of weeks, rather than if I'm eating in a good diet and well, low in carbs and really high on meat and protein, I feel better and mentally I feel better. And it's not nothing that has to be with my social life, but for instance, those other factors, those other variables, I think they're also important. I don't know what's your take on that.
So I think you're 100% right. And I think that there's actually research to back you up. Now, I can't speak extensively on this because I don't do this research and it's very new. But there's a something, there's like how we have the nervous system in our brain. Our brain is like the head of the nervous system that basically helps fuel our decision making. For a while, we thought like our intestines, where we would digest things, were just, tubes that brought food into our body, essentially. Now there's more research that's actually showing that there is a nervous system in your intestines, and it doesn't just control how your intestines move, it actually can have measurable effects on your cognition and on your ability to basically interact with the world. And so I don't think there's a lot of research yet that really shows how diet affects on a neuroscience level how you feel. But I think you're right. If you're eating poorly, you're going to feel worse. And I think if you're eating well, it's going to help your mental health. And maybe in the next decade or 2 decades, we'll actually know why that works on a scientific level. But I think right now, there's no reason to ever say, like, oh, fixing your diet isn't going to help you feel better, because it's just not true. And I think we know that just from living life. So I 100% agree with you. I think exercise falls in there as well. There's like, basically, if there's one thing that I've learned in medical school, everything I've rotated through, everything I've learned from like my classes and my clinical rotations, one thing we tell basically everyone to do if they're able to do it: exercise. You're going to feel better.
Right. You will say that
Yeah.
there is a direct correlation between exercise and probably a wellness between people.
I would say almost
Under your
certainly.
perspective, right? You don't have any
Yeah. Yeah.
facts.
Exercise, there is more. Like if you exercise, it releases this chemical called BDNF into your brain, and like it might be one of the few things that help you like preserve brain health. And some people, it's a bit fuzzy if you can make new brain cells or not. But some people would even argue that it could help in a very small amount make new brain cells. But that research is a little fuzzier. But yeah, exercise has like been shown numerous times, time and time again, to just really help with wellness and keeping you young.
Right. And before we though dive more into more theories, and because I'm really curious to ask you, okay, what are your favorite theories? What's your research focusing about right now?
Yeah.
I wanted to get your
Uh-huh.
definition of psychiatry. What's psychiatry for you, and how would you describe it to people that are maybe think, oh, just a psychiatrist is somebody who deals with just crazy people? Because that's like my first impression. Obviously, I know it goes further than that, but that's like the more broad, high level definition of a psychiatrist that I have. So, how would you define a psychiatrist for just the world that is
I
listening
think
to
it's
us?
I think it's a good question, because a lot of people I meet, even people who like are in kind of like close to the medical field, often get psychiatry and psychology confused.
Right.
All
Um,
right.
and so like the
What's the
difference
difference between? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the formal difference is like a psychologist is someone you would go to for therapy, where a psychiatrist people typically go to receive medications, and they deal with more of the high level mental illness, the schizophrenia and things like that. But the truth of the matter is, and one reason why I like psychiatry, as a psychiatrist, you have the option to do what a psychologist does. I'll get training in doing therapy just as much as I will in medication management. So what's unique to psychiatry is that we treat what's called psychiatric illness, which is like things that can be handled with medication: schizophrenia, bipolar, obviously like extreme depression. But you can also, as a psychiatrist, treat what is called maybe psychological illness, or just like lower level, like, hey, I'm having trouble with my life, like I'm feeling bad. We can do therapy on that as well. Um, And then there's another kind of interesting thing that we as psychiatrists assess but have a hard time treating. Those are things that you would call like personality disorders, like if you've heard of like, being like antisocial or a psychopath
Right.
or like being a narcissist. These are personality disorders that are psychiatrically diagnosed, but they're quite hard they're basically impossible as our current understanding to treat with psychiatric medication. So they're not psychiatric, but
Right.
you could do behavioral therapy, which is, more psychological and treat them that way. And that's the same with like a lot of behavioral problems as well. So I guess for me, what psychiatry like technically stands for is the medical doctor who can prescribe medications and treat psychiatric illness. But by virtue of our training in both therapy and mental illness as a whole, along with the medications, I would say the psychiatrist, if they want, is equipped to really work with anyone in the mental health field, and even people who maybe they don't qualify for a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, but they just need a little help along the way. There are plenty of psychiatrists who treat those people as well.
Right. Yeah,
Oh,
100%. That was an amazing definition. Rafa, you have anything to say? Sorry.
man, amazing definition. Bringing back to your point, I'm, I, I agree with you with defining of your purpose. Probably I think maybe I do, when I say I'm going to do something and then I don't do it, or then I punch a goal in my wall, I say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this every day of my fucking life. Then when the day comes and I don't do that thing, man, a feeling in my head appears like I feel sad. I don't know what to do, and just to don't do that shit, So I agree with you with your point that the find of purpose is a really cure of depression. Sometimes, and I think that everybody in this world at some point feel depressed. At some point feel depressed, and I follow a lot of coaches, life coaches, and all say the same. Hey, find a purpose. You are walking without a purpose. You don't have meaning in your life. So that's the reason you are depressed. So I think, and I agree with your definition that the best way to cure depression is find a purpose. And I don't know, see what you like in this world and start doing it, right?
I completely agree. I think that's the first step that everyone should really find is like what drives you. Because after that, everything else falls into place, really.
Yeah, and that comes then with a follow-up question for you, Tritan. What drives you? What's your purpose being a psychiatrist? I think you kind of touch into it, but deeply, like from when you were a kid, do you had that idea really clear, or did you say, "Oh, I wanted to be a surgeon," or what is it that motive that gets you now like excited about this and brings you there like every day to grind all the medical school stuff that you have to do, you know?
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you asked this question because it's a question I ask myself like all the time. It's a very, it's hard to, not because I feel like I don't know it, but because it's hard to
Okay.
put something like this into words.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so for me, I think when I was young, I didn't think I was going to be a psychiatrist. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. When I was young, I guess I found my interest. I like to read books. I like to, I love the story, whether it be in a movie, a book, a video game, anything like that. I loved it. And so when I got into high school, I started interacting with like the creative arts, and doing a lot of writing, doing some acting, things like that. And I said, I really like this. But I think what I liked about it was, in addition to just like liking the arts, is that, to tell a story, what's a story at the end of the day? It's a story about what people are on a fundamental level, how we relate to one another, how we do things, and kind of what the meaning of life is. And I think that was really interesting. And when I started doing my science classes in high school, even learning more about the brain, I took a psychology class, I took a bit of a neuroscience class, and I did some reading on my own. And I said, you know what? Like, how do we think? How do we do things? What makes us speak? What makes us make decisions? That's usually the brain. So when I was about 18, I said, you know what? I think I want to be a psychiatrist. I think that's a good way to study what it means to be a human, what it means to be conscious. And also, it still allows me to engage somewhat in like kind of the arts, right? Because, mental health can be tied to creativity, mental health can be tied to wellness, all of these things. So I started off as a psychiatrist. Then I saw some brain surgery and I said, you know what? Mechanically, that's even closer. Like that's closer to seeing the brain. You're actually removing parts of it, you're putting things onto it, you're doing things that that in theory should change someone's behavior in their life in a very meaningful and direct way. But for me, what I realized was that even though, yes, you're very close to the brain while operating on it. Oh,
Okay.
yeah, you're very close to the brain while operating on it. It's much less like philosophical. And so that's another thing that turned me back to psychiatry. I really like that philosophical and almost creative way of exploring it. And when you have a psychiatric patient, everyone's life is so diverse, everyone's life is so unique that
Right.
even if they come into you, you see 50 people with depression in a week, that depression is going to look very different each time. And what caused that's going to look different. So it's always interesting.
Yeah, I guess
Well,
that one of the biggest problems for you is to find how can you bring this broad perspective from all the people and all the problems, and you're trying to find correlations between all the variables. Okay, what are there any relationships between these patients and the other ones, or the other 50, when they all have different backgrounds and probably different triggers for all of their sickness, and it's quite hard. I truly admire you for that, and just trying to put all of these things together. It's a hard job, 100%. And so I guess unless Rafa has another question on the same topic, I want to ask you if you had any theories in psychiatry that you like. For instance, when you talked about uh, the behavioral science and that side of okay, bipolarity and all of these kind of sickness that, yeah, are medicated, but they have a big behavioral path to them, or characteristic, for putting it in a way. I've heard 2 years ago or 1 year ago, and I think it's one of my favorite theories, is the one of the multiplicity of the mind. So apparently there's this psychiatrist, I don't remember the name right now, but he was invited to a podcast, and he was talking how this movie is Split. I don't know if you have heard of it.
I've seen it, yeah.
Yeah, and how that movie did a lot of harm to the world, or his theory of the multiplicity of the mind. And I feel like he's a little bit of an outcast in the psychiatry world, because he says, well, we in our head uh, usually have like this X amount of personalities, in a way. Like, oh, we have happy Mario, we have sad Mario, we have the defensive Mario, we have the offensive Mario, and we have all of these persons living in our brains, and some of them have lived trauma, and some of them were created from trauma, right? So, for instance, if you were molested for saying something when you were a kid, then that might drive a consequence in your adulthood, and you might get triggered by certain actions or certain things, and then you know that it's like this Mario or this Rafa or this Tritan taking the control of you for some time, until you go back to yourself. So his theory was, okay, yeah, we have a multiplicity of the mind, meaning that we have multiple personalities, just like this movie Split. But then we have to understand them, and we have to try to really keep like, oh, why is Mario being offensive here? Like, what's the root reason? How can we talk to this? How behavioral therapy can work with us in this kind of theory? And I feel like ever since I've applied like this sort of mindset to when I feel like, oh, I'm being an asshole, or I'm doing this thing, I'm trying to go to a roots, like, hey Mario, why are you doing this? What are the root causes, and how can we improve this? How can we overcome whatever trauma I have that it's pushing me to do something, and trying to transform it to a different thing? So, for instance, that's one of my favorite theories about psychiatry, because I feel like I've used it and kind of helped out. And I don't know if even I would like your perspective on that. That's my first question on the multiplicity on the mind theory. And if you have any favorite theories, any things that you are really curious about and you would like to share to the world, plus help yourself and tell us about it.
Yeah, so that's great. And I think I agree with whoever the psychiatrist was that Split was not a great portrayal of like psychiatric illness. One, because the diagnosis that they give him with this like extreme multiple personality, where he's switching from like basically completely different people. And then I don't know if you've seen the movie, but at the end he becomes like almost like a beast. Like
Right.
it's way over the top. It's
Yeah.
kind of ridiculous, and I do think that it was not a good portrayal. But while I'm not super familiar with the details of the multiplicity of the mind, I do think I know what you're talking about. I think it's like very valid, right? I mean, there's something that I've learned, it might be similar. It's called like various states of consciousness. And this is a
Okay.
widely accepted thing, right? Like sleep is a state of consciousness. It's a low state, but you're dreaming, you're thinking, your brain's active. Being awake is a state of consciousness, you know. And then also things like, excuse me, um, things like being intoxicated with alcohol or substances. Those will change your behaviors. They'll change how you act. They'll change how you treat other people. And that's a different state of consciousness. But also, one thing that I like to think about, and I don't know how well documented this is, but I'm sure it is somewhere, maybe not so much in psychiatry, but in sociology, social pressures, like how you go about your day, who you're with, is going to change how you interact, a different type of the mind, a different multiplicity, if you will, a different self. Um, because if I'm in a professional setting working with people who have, for example, a lot of my doctors I work with, they have control over my grade or my letter of recommendation on how I get a job. That's going to cause me to act a little bit differently than when I'm hanging out with my friends on a Saturday, where it's going to be way more casual. And
Right.
so I think when you brought up this idea of, say someone was molested, and how do we understand how that drives that type of trauma, a trauma reaction in the self, in their mind, it's actually really important because I worked for some time in one of my rotations in medical school in the psychiatric ED. And
Right.
unfortunately, we saw a lot of people come in with profound behavioral problems because they had sexual trauma at a very young age. And these people were young teenagers who were already going through a lot of like biological changes. And they would come in with their family, and their family would say, hey, they're running around the streets at night, sleeping with, in some cases, people as old as 40 years old at
Oh,
the age of
Wow.
13. Yeah,
That's
sorry,
insane.
it's quite dark. So sorry for that. But
No, that's right.
when they would come in, um, to like, excuse me, can I grab a water for a second?
Yeah,
yeah, right on.
sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So,
yeah,
what's up, Mario?
we're
Yeah.
waiting for Triton. He's looking for some water, and I want your perspective, Rafa. You've been quite quiet.
Man, I think the thing you say, the multiplicity of the mind, right?
Uh-huh.
It's kind of a really good perspective because there is this definition of or this theory that talks about we wear mask in different aspects of our life. So, for example, if we're in a party, we're wearing the party mask, the persuasive mask, the political mask. If we are alone, I mean, we are just wearing our mask or regular mask. If we are working, we are wearing our working mask. So it changed. It changed. So it's really accurate that definition, but a long time ago, I discovered, yeah, this shit is right, because I used to see my father in the work area, and he were wearing a mask, a different mask from his personal life. Then in his personal life, he was another different person, and then when he was in a party, he was another person. He was the most faithful person, the most happy person, the most persuasive person. But when he was working, he was like the toughest guy, kind of the opposite one of the other mask. So I think it's really accurate that definition or that theory. What do you
Right.
think about
No, I think it's right, and that's why is it one of my favorites? And Triton, sorry.
I know.
You can follow up with your story. Think you
Yeah,
were how you find these kids and these people that I don't know, is 13 years old and then goes to the clinic and they've been having sex with plenty of for people of men or whatever of 40 years old and all of this traumatic stuff. So you were
So
going into that.
yeah, what we would see with these patients was that the family would say that their behavior was quite poor. They would fight with them, they would run away, but when they would come to us, because they knew what would happen, they didn't want to come to the psychiatric hospital. They didn't want treatment because in their mind, they were doing what they wanted to do, and we would restrict their freedom. They would behave in a way where they were like, I'm not doing that. They're lying. They're telling you that things are doing, they're telling you things that aren't true about me. So they would put on somewhat of an artificial self as a way to avoid engaging in psychiatric treatment. And so that makes it hard to address the true self underneath what's going on because they're kind of putting on this facade because they don't really want to engage with us. So in some way, like you can artificially create a multiplicity of the mind by saying, I don't want to be here, I don't want to do this. And so I'm going to tell you a story that's fictitious. And I'm not saying all of it's fictitious. I'm sure there's the truth lies somewhere in the middle always. But
Yeah.
the families often show us documentation that prove that the child was not being fully honest with us. And
Right.
so it is hard to address some of these things that are going on underneath that involve trauma most times because the patient is often not willing and putting on a false self to avoid kind of talking about that, especially with us as people who are seen as like the opposition almost because we're the doctors. We're going to make you do something you don't want, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total
Wow.
sense, and it's crazy. Like, well, I feel like it's on one hand, it's a social thing, right? Like
Mhm.
in the French parties, like hundreds of years ago, they people had to put their facades and be a total different person rather than when you were uh just working, right? And it's like, wait, well, you go to a party, you put a facade and you're having fun and you're being happy, but what's the real person behind? But when you get to these cases and people is actually hiding stuff, like it's hard to find, okay, how bad is this? Like what's actually happened? Because if they're lying in your face, like how can you identify like what's true and what are the facts, right? And I wanted to ask you, since you see this sort of stuff like every day, is there anything or any red flags that we can see in people that we know, like friends or something, that might lead us to say, okay, this is not right. Like there's something off. This is something's wrong with these guys. It's acting weird, but something there are there red flags that we can figure when you're working on this man or these people, or it's just like according to each personality and each people is different. And well, if you know somebody for a long time and then started to behave differently, uh yeah, something actually happened. But what if they've have some red flags ever since you met them and then oh, there's a correlation between this thing happening and this having root in some trauma that is very common in a cluster of people for saying something.
Yeah, so I think there are two things I can offer here that I learned from the psychiatrists that I work with in my own time working with patients is
Right.
that one, we are very, very bad at predicting whether or not someone will kill themselves. It's just the unfortunate truth. And how we get around that is by having an extremely low threshold to be concerned and also by following someone over time. For example, again, when I was in the emergency department, the psych emergency department, if someone came in, they were looking sad and they were scared enough to come in, and they had very little like social support, very little friends. They had guns in their home, and they said, "You know what? I don't know what I'm doing. I might end my life today." They're coming in. That's an easy time. Now, if someone's doing a little better, they've had like engagement with mental health treatment in the past, they have a lot of friends, they're just feeling a little down, they got worked up. Maybe that person gets to go home. But the thing that we always keep in mind is that we don't know what someone can do 6 hours from now. So if there's very little harm in keeping someone for a couple days, provided especially they get to go to like the appropriate floor in the hospital for them and their mental health condition. So we usually always err on the side of caution. And now one way that we always assess things too, because I in the ED only met this person right now and talk to them for 30 minutes to an hour and a half, I don't know their entire life story. I would always ask if they have a family member or a friend I can call, and I would talk to them. And so that's where someone like, say you had a friend who was not doing well, keeping an eye on them is one helpful just so you can check in and say, hey, I've noticed you've been a little different lately. Things maybe even there were red flags at baseline, but things have gone a little worse. How are you doing? That's helpful. But also in certain cases, like I have called people's family members numerous times. I said, what's going on? Tell me everything you need to know. And most importantly, I was like, if I send them home today and don't bring them into the hospital with me, do you think they're going to be safe at home? And if that person says no, I almost always listen to that person. And the only time that I would really ever not listen to something like that, there's a small group of people these people have mental illness and they require psychiatric help. But a lot of
Right.
times they would do things that they would call suicide attempts that were not necessarily fatal or lethal. And the goal is sometimes to actually get into the mental health hospital for various reasons. Sometimes these people like the idea of being in a system of care that's usually called like factitious disorder.
Right.
And other times people find like it is like a nice social outlet, but regardless, because they don't really like intend to end their life, the psych hospital is not the place for them. We usually send those people home, but we urge them very, very heavily to go to like an outpatient psychiatrist who they see in an office or a clinic maybe once a week, once a month.
Right.
And that's how we would treat them, just because the hospital is not the appropriate place. Not because we don't think they need mental health services, just because the hospital isn't where they're going to get help.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess my advice is always have a low threshold, always check in, and really you have to see how someone's doing over time because a snapshot of time in their life is not always good enough to estimate how likely someone is to end their own life or do something else just tragic.
Yeah. No,
Uh,
it's incredible, and you see him every day in the news, like, oh, this guy killed himself, and then
Yeah,
he was the happiest guy in the world, like
exactly.
everybody thought he was the happiest guy, but then some people have problems, and that's a fact. Like everybody has some amount of problems that we don't even know what's happening through everybody's mind. But yeah, I agree with you. If you know somebody and you feel like they're having a hard time, you better check out on them. And that leads me to my next question for you, Triton, unless Rafa wants to intervene.
yeah, I have a question. I have a question from
Okay, okay, just
Triton.
go ahead.
Yeah, Triton. Do you think there is a correlation between philosophy and in a way to cure, I don't know, or in a way to find the well-being? Because for myself, I think philosophy is this system of creations or system of belief that guides you in this world, because we came to this world, we learn about our fathers, about the school, about shit, but we don't know exactly how to live, right? Nobody teaches that. So, do you think there is a correlation between philosophy, that system of belief, and the well being of the mind?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and one that I always think about too, because I like philosophy as well, and I think it's a helpful way to learn how to guide your life. In terms of like, could I find a study that did a scientific correlation? I think it's just not the right. I think it would be hard to do that, but
Okay.
if you,
But
if you if
what,
you were to,
what do you think about it?
yeah, I think as far as like can by interacting with philosophy to basically find a way to live my life through wellness by better understanding how other people around me live, how I think about the world, and how people in the past have thought about the world. I think absolutely. I think there's a natural kind of curiosity in most people to figure out what's the point of life? Why am I here? And philosophy, oftentimes, in one way or another, seeks to answer that. And there is no way that learning about how other people think and kind of developing your own philosophical thoughts is going to do anything but help you live a more happy and enriched life. Even if you adopt maybe, I don't know, one of the darker philosophies, if you become a nihilist and say nothing has purpose, I mean that's your own choice, but
Uh,
I think even then, learning about that stuff, reading about that stuff is very helpful, and I try to do it all the time. So yeah, I think especially maybe if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia, reading about philosophy is not going to be the sole thing that helps you. But if you're looking for wellness and happiness and purpose in your life, I think, yeah, absolutely. And I try to read philosophy all the time in my free time. So I agree with you 100%.
Oh, that's amazing. What do you usually read?
I try to read a couple different things. One thing that I read um, recently, I read a lot of, if you know, like Albert Camus, he's a French philosopher and novelist from like maybe early 1900s. Um,
Really?
he has a book called The Myth of Sisyphus, which is like the Greek Titan who was punished to roll the boulder up the hill all for all eternity.
Right.
And in this book, he kind of argues, what what is the point? Like, why doesn't everyone, life's hard, why don't we all just kill ourselves? And in the end, he decides that no, you can't kill yourself. Life may be hard. Life may be kind of, like have come with a lot of perils, but and even if it has no grand divine purpose, whether you believe that or not, he said that you can find purpose in your life even if things don't truly matter, and you can find things to enjoy that make life worth living. And it's like an absurdist point, but it's very true to my belief. I think no matter what you believe in, you can always find a point to life, find something
Right.
to do, and life is a beautiful thing that you must hold on to. There's another book I want to read. It's called Simulation and Simulacrum by another French philosopher. It's a little bit different. He talks a lot about this. I haven't read it yet, but my understanding is he talks a lot about how basically like society is becoming a simulation of itself. And so we have like increasingly less legitimate ways of doing things in society. And that's a little darker, a little sadder, but I want to read it anyway. Just kind of because I think like it's important to read some of these darker things to have insight yourself into like how to create something that's authentic, how to give someone like say for example, you provide a service for someone or an entertainment for someone like your podcast, right? There are a
Right.
million podcasts that are kind of, washed out, generic, designed to, peddle ads to people and sell you something. And that's kind of what this book gets at. There's a lot of things in society that are not very legitimate or authentic. And so I always want to, in whatever I do, give someone something that's authentic, something that's like worth what they either have to pay or the time, whether that be in time or money. And so reading stuff up like that, I think, is helpful to just kind of keep some insight because we all like things that are legitimate. And,
Right.
I don't think anyone likes like going somewhere to see like a concert and the concert's one big advertisement, right? You want something real, you want something artful.
Right. No, I agree
Oh,
100% with you.
yeah.
And yeah, hopefully we have proven that we're being very honest and we are having our best time trying to do the show and pull it together. But yeah, the myth of Sisyphus, I don't really know the name of the book very well, but I want to say that for anybody who wants to maybe not read the book, but to listen to these summaries about the Sisyphus thing and a lot of the Camus series and Dostoevsky, for instance, there's this really good podcaster called Philosophize This, and I've heard like all the Camus series, all the Dostoevsky series, and it's a pretty good way to have, okay, I have 40 minutes that I can hear to something that I think is interesting rather than just hearing to music, you know? I mean, music is fun, but sometimes you want to hear something that makes you learn. For instance, I'm a coder, I'm a computer science student, and sometimes most of the time I spend my time in my computer just writing code, right? So rather than just listening to music, I put one of these podcasts and then I'm learning something new. For instance, like, oh, Crime and Punishment. I don't know if you have heard about it, but it's this guy who says, oh, okay, I'm gonna kill this person because I think he's a bad person. But after they kill the person, he had to kill the sister, and then it's a whole shit show because, okay, how you carry this moral thing that, okay, I killed somebody, but why? Why am I God? Like, is it that good? And same with Camus and Sisyphus. It's like, okay, am I rolling this rock up this hill? And what's the purpose if I'm never gonna get to the top, you know? And I think it connects very well with me and the purpose of life because most of the time we're looking at the journey, right? One of my favorite books is Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea. I don't know if you have heard of it, Triton.
It's a wonderful book.
It's a wonderful book, but it touches the same idea, you know. It's this guy that his dream is to get this fish, and it's gonna be the best fish in the world, and he's fighting with the fish for like a month or so, and at the end he gets the fish, he enjoys the fish. Oh, yeah, I got it. Now I have to paddle back to Cuba in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle, right? And then the whole fish is gone by the time she arrives to shore. And it's like, okay, what was the purpose of this? Yeah, I had a good time fighting with the fish, but what was the purpose of it? And I feel like it connects with Sisyphus in a way because it's all about the journey and all the fight that this guy had in his life trying to get this fish or in these few weeks. And then he just had to come back and yeah, I did the thing. I'm great, but now it's gonna start a new day. I'm just gonna sleep, and that's what he did. And it's just life, you know. You don't even know if if your goal is to make $1 million. Yeah, you're fighting, and then you make $1 million, and it might not feel as cool as you think it will feel, you know. And I feel like philosophy is connecting to Rafa and agreeing with his point is one of the most important things that we as human beings have or have to think about because it's basically where are we heading? Why are we here? What are we here put on earth? You know, like what's our goal as human beings? And for instance, Stoicism was one of the branches of philosophy that really has helped me out, and it really has made myself to evolve in a way. And I feel like I've been a better person ever since I read Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus and all of these people. Uh, but anyways, to not go in more tangents, so do you have any? I feel did you say your favorite theories or we went on a tangent on that?
We went on a tangent, but thank you. I'll have to listen to philosophize this. That'll be great. Because like I've read some Dostoevsky, I love him, but they are not short books, so you don't always have
No.
time.
No, they
Um,
are not. But
yeah, I guess one of my favorite theories right now in the realm of psychiatry is I think it's not so much as a theory in the sense of like here's how the multiple minds work, but so much more of a way of looking at the architecture of the brain in such a way that I think will allow us to learn a lot more about mental illness in the future. So before there were two ways in which people would look at the brain. Kind of like if you know like anything about like physics, I'm sure you do if you know a
Yeah.
lot of math to be a coder. Like how like Einstein's relativity was kind of the zoomed out macroscopic view of the motion of objects, and then quantum mechanics is the microscopic view of how things navigate and move.
Right.
Psychiatry has a similar kind of view in the past. There was like the zoomed out. This is like the social and behavioral aspects that garner, the characteristics of the disease and govern how you present. And then
Right.
there's the zoomed in view that people would look at on the actual neuron level, and they would say, oh, well, this receptor in the brain is downregulated compared to a healthy person when you look at a person with depression. And that's great. It has provided information, but it really hasn't helped us with treatment all that much. And I think the reason for that is like there's billions of neurons in your brain, and anytime you do anything, speak, move, think, any sort of complex action, hundreds of thousands to millions of those are firing at once. So to look at any single one doesn't particularly provide, I think, the most useful information when treating. And so what we're trying to do now is look at this intermediate level between this kind of zoomed out view and this kind of zoomed in view. And it's
Right.
what's being called like the network level. We actually use a lot of coding and computational analysis to look at it. So instead of looking
Okay.
at one neuron or just a person's behavior, we try to map through brain activity of maybe hundreds of thousands to millions of neurons what the brain activity looks like in terms of like firing rate, electrical amplitude, um, activation or deactivation of certain regions to kind
Wow.
of see what happens when you're depressed compared to a normal person. Or I shouldn't say a normal person, but a person who's not feeling depressed at that time. You know,
yeah,
what's different here? And then how can we use maybe medications, maybe therapy, maybe some of these new treatments that actually are brain stimulation techniques to really help people. But I think that's going to be huge because there's a treatment. It's actually been around for a long time, but it was stigmatized because of the book and movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, unfortunately.
Mm.
Um, though it's one of the best treatments in all medicine. It's called electroconversion therapy.
Okay.
Basically, if I were to say, if you were to come to me and say, I'm depressed, I've tried therapy, it didn't work. I've been depressed for years. I've tried numerous medications of different types. I've tried combinations of medications. I've been to the psych hospital. Nothing has helped me at all, and I'm still very depressed. We would basically put two electrodes on the sides of your heads, your head, and over the course of several weeks, we would give you short sessions of low voltage electrical stimulation. And sometimes this can serve as a hard reset for the brain, and it can make people who wanted to kill themselves last week feel great the next week. It doesn't work for everyone. It has to be, the person who's selected has to be a good candidate, but it's very effective, and it works on this kind of network model. When it was invented, no one really knew why it worked. They had no idea about this network of brain activity. But now, as we look at it more, I think there will be a lot of new treatments in psychiatry that will work better than just giving someone an SSRI. And so I think that's really, really exciting. One, because it's scientifically interesting, and two, I think again it can help a lot of people. And it kind of brings like technology and coding into like this biological kind of realm. And I think that's interesting to me as well, because I've done some research in that kind of interface area anyway.
That's
Well,
pretty cool stuff, and I'm really interested. I want to get into bioinformatics in some way,
Oh,
and I was
nice.
thinking like where more specific, like genomics, but I think like this mental health, like neurons, neuroscience side of things, it's really interesting to me. And yeah, I might get your contact or LinkedIn as well after
Of
this, just to
course.
connect and just get some more insight on it. But talking about these therapies, right? Like, first of all, I have like an anecdote, and I want to connect with two questions, right? So first, uh, people say, oh, there's this psychedelic boom, right? Like, oh, you do a ayahuasca trip and you'll cure yourself, or you microdose some mushrooms and you'll
yeah,
be having fun, right? And on one hand, I think like, for instance, I left alcohol and smoking pot, if I ever did, just because I thought that it was killing my neurons, right? And I don't know, I want to know how true that is. Like, how true is like, oh, drinking alcohol will make you dumber eventually, and or smoking pot or doing any other kind of hard drugs or whatever, and how true do you think that is? And then to connect with this psychedelic experience and psychedelic boom, like how truthful is, oh, having an ayahuasca trip or having a peyote kind of trip or these sort of things are how truthful those things are, and what's your take on that? You're are more related into this than me.
Yeah, so this is actually a hot topic in psychiatry right now. It is true if you drink alcohol, alcohol, like your neurons in your brain is basically like a glob of fat, and alcohol is fat soluble. So it can get in, it can slow the neuron firing rate and eventually lead to neuron death. Like that's true. If you drink a lot, you will be killing brain cells. And you have to weigh the benefits of like, hey, I like drinking alcohol. I've had some fun times doing it. Um, Compared to it is a toxin. And marijuana is similar. Some people will preach like these, amazing benefits to marijuana. There are some, sure, like it's good for pain control. It can be good for anxiety and sleep. But in the long run, like using marijuana a lot can dull like prefrontal, the front of your brain cortex activity, and just kind of lead to, also just like some maladaptive behaviors. You don't want to be like relying on a substance for sleep if you can help it, or using it as like a crutch. And that's not just with like recreational drugs. I believe that that's true for medical drugs that you prescribe to someone. Ideally, you don't want to be super reliant on them. Um, but with the psychedelics, it's interesting. There are a lot of places that you will go across the country, universities that swear by them, that say, we love psychedelics. We think they're the next big thing. And then there are places like where I train at the University of Pittsburgh, where the psychiatrists here are a bit more skeptical. They'll say that it doesn't work. In fact, the data for ketamine in the short term for people who are not depressed enough to get the electrical stimulation that I was just talking about, but still very depressed and medications aren't working, microdosing ketamine has shown that it has been quite helpful for them. The problem is that it's new. And so the issue with that is that we don't know what microdosing ketamine is going to do to your brain over 10 years. And that's the problem. You might feel better now because you've just taken a drug that some people just use as a party drug anyway, so they might feel better. And 10 years later, you'll have basically burned out your neurons. Um, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I don't know. But the reason that people, I think, should be skeptical of it, and that like why my mentors are skeptical of it, is because there's not enough information to really tell if it's working in the long run. And if it works in the short term, I mean, that's ultimately the patient's choice if they want to take on that risk. But ideally, you want a treatment that's going to be good to go for a long time. And one interesting story I actually heard from a psychiatrist I knew who was older, he said, I treated a lot of people back in the 70s when like the Woodstock era was huge. People were doing a lot of drugs, specifically like psychedelics and, MDMA and things like that. And they had done so many of these substances that over the next 10 to 20 years, they developed crippling mental illness and their brains were kind of just for lack of a better, more scientific term, turned to mush and they would just not respond to any like actual medications that they became so profoundly depressed that they would just kind of stop taking care of themselves and slowly die. And so that was the story he gave me of his experience of why he said, I'm a little skeptical on these psychedelics because I've seen them do some terrible things to people. I would like to wait a little bit longer before I really hop on the ketamine train, the psilocybin train, the peyote train.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
Makes total sense. It's new
and,
technology.
and what do you
Yeah.
think about nicotine or these smart drugs, or they call it smart drugs or nootropics like lion's mane, or they are a lot. But nicotine, for example.
Yeah, I mean, nicotine's an interesting drug because when you look at the mechanism of action, right? Like, for example, if you were to do something like cocaine literally, there's a chemical that makes you feel good, it makes you feel aroused, it gives you energy.
Okay.
It's called dopamine. I'm sure, like, it's pretty, it's actually
Yeah.
pretty common now in like, colloquial language as well. Like, if you do something like methamphetamine or cocaine, they basically just shoot dopamine out into the space where your neurons absorb it and use it.
Okay.
Um, and so that's like a direct way of influencing how you feel. Nicotine works a little differently. It binds to this area called the ventral tegmental area in your brain, which basically tells you what feels good and what feels bad. It's like called a reward center in your brain. And it makes that area easier to signal to the rest of your brain, this feels good. So nicotine is a bit insidious because if you use it, it doesn't just make you feel good directly, it makes everything else make you feel good easier. And so obviously it's going to have some stimulating effects. Obviously it's going to make you feel like less tired, more alert, things like that. I'm assuming I don't know much about how like lion's mane works directly on the brain, but I'm assuming a lot of neurotropics may work in at least some similar capacity. And I guess the way I would look at it is like we usually don't tell people to stop smoking because of the nicotine so much. That's what makes it addicting, and people want to
Yeah.
keep it. But it's all the other stuff in a cigarette that's really what's causing you harm. Not to say that like I would like recommend people to just like use nicotine, but I think like the idea behind it is again, you probably as you use more of any substance, whether it be nootropic, whether it be you know alcohol, nicotine, like in small doses, yeah, you could probably feel an increase in performance, sure. But when you become reliant on the substance to perform at baseline is when you should be starting to be concerned. So like I don't know, I like caffeine, I like coffee. I think coffee works as a nootropic as well. You drink it, and you feel energized. But I wouldn't want to get to the point in my life where I have to drink 7 coffees a day to be able to do my work, if that makes
Right.
sense. So things in moderation, especially because I would say with nicotine, it's harder to say that because a lot of the products that nicotine is packaged in have other things with it that are not super healthy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And for example, caffeine. Some people say caffeine is bad for you, and some people say it's the best for you. What do you think about it?
Yeah, so if you take too much caffeine, like over for adult male, they recommend 400 milligrams a day. That's about 3 coffees. Um, after you take more than that, it can have like very bad effects on your like arteries and veins. It can like cause them to kind of clench up and like, make your heart work harder.
Yeah.
That could be pretty bad. That's unhealthy. There have been some scientific studies that show moderate caffeine use, maybe like two coffees a day, can actually be helpful with like focus and actually helping your arteries be healthier. Now, the
Well,
data on both sides is mixed. Unfortunately, that's how a lot of these things go. It's not a clear cut picture for one thing or the other, or we would just tell everyone, hey, do caffeine every day. So I don't know. I think that if you do it in moderation, it's probably fine for you. It could be healthy, it could be benign, as long as you're not doing too much. I mean, I think you're probably fine, and it could be a little bit helpful. I say that, of course, because I like coffee. So there's
yeah,
my
You're
yeah, I
so
my
like
bot.
biased.
caffeine too.
Yeah, but I mean, for this
uh,
kind of things, it's very curious because I think there's one big factor out, and it's the physiological side of things that, well, everybody's genetics are 100%, they're not 100% different, but mostly different, right? Like we're unique human beings in a way. So each substance will make might be better for Rafa, but might be worse for me, or Rafa might be allergic to something, I might be allergic to something else. And I feel like it extrapolates for other sort of substances, even though we have a pretty good or pretty decent understanding of how the brain works and how all the chemists, all the chemics, or all these substances work. uh, it's
oh
weird.
my God.
It's weird. It's like it's just how do we know how to get a strong correlation and a strong cure and a strong thing for all the people? Like we don't know how all the drugs will interact with all the people, and because like it or not, we're basically different, but we are very similar in a way, right? And I don't know if Rafa has more stuff to say, but I think we can be closing it up real soon. So I don't know if you have last thoughts about that, Triton, and I don't know
Yeah.
if Rafa wants to say anything else.
So one thing I would like to say about that, I think you're 100% right in the terms that like there are genetic variabilities that make it hard to zone in on the right treatment for the right person. And I know you said you're interested in genomics. I did some cancer genomics research in my time when I did full research in part of my medical school career. And a lot of like the new stuff that people want to look at is actually doing something called precision medicine. They'll look at basically variations in certain genes that we know what they do. For example, your likelihood to metabolize a drug fast, to metabolize it slow, or to not metabolize it at all. And using that information, they can actually better tailor a medication for you. That could be applied to mental health fields, of course. We don't know enough about it in the mental health region yet to really use it, but just anywhere in the body, like understanding the unique genetic variations between people, I think is going to be in the next 20 to 50 years huge because instead of like, hey, let's kind of shotgun approach, give you a couple meds, see if they work, and you're in pain or you're still having problems for the next year or so, we can maybe, you know, give you a quick blood test when you walk in the door. And by the time you leave, it's here's the medication that's most likely going to work for you. So
Yeah,
that's very exciting. And I agree.
yeah, I
Well,
agree.
well, I have one last question, Triton, and it is, why do you think is there
I'm
a lot
sorry.
of why do you think there is a lot of difference between theories or in the medical world about theories? For example, some doctor says, okay, if you eat this diet, this kind of diet, you're going to be good. And then there is another doctor that says the contrary, that says like, hey, don't eat that shit because you're going to die. Why do you think why do you think it's so that different? For example, I I practice the keto diet. I try to eat less carbs as possible. But some people say, hey, why you don't eat carbs? You don't have energy. And why is that different in the medical world about theories? Because someone says something and another one says another thing. Which one do you true? In
Yeah,
which one do you believe?
I think it's really what I would look at it from people I know working with the medical field. It really comes down to your tolerance for the unknown, right? Because, for example, no one really argues that like blood pressure medications don't work because we've proven it. We've proven that if we give you a blood pressure medication, your blood pressure is going to go down. There's nothing to be confused about there. Now, on these newer treatments, like for example, I have a friend, she's a PhD, she does research on the keto diet and how it affects cancer metabolism, but normal metabolism too. There's a lot of debate on whether keto works, whether intermittent fasting works. And the reason is just because we don't know the science yet, I think. And so different people will have different thresholds and beliefs. And that's what you really have to come into it. For example, someone might say, okay, I don't know if the keto diet works, but it's not going to, if it's not hurting you, then I'm fine if you try it. Do you? Another person who says, I don't like taking any risk on something unknown at all will say, don't try the keto diet because I don't know what's going to happen. And that's worse than me telling you to do something where I know what's going to happen. Um, and then other people will have their own opinions on things. You have to always remember that even though people are in the medical field, they have their own opinions, they have their own personal biases. For example, someone who doesn't really like coffee might say, I think caffeine is bad for you because you might get addicted to it and drink it too much. So I'd recommend no caffeine. Where, like I just said, I like coffee. I think it tastes good. I like having it. I'm more likely to say, you know what, just have caffeine in moderation. It'll most likely be fine. People have been drinking it for thousands of years. You'll be fine. And that works with like any decision across the board. If someone thinks that if someone like their personal beliefs, they think that sounds dumb, that sounds silly, they're going to tell you that they don't believe it and they'll use the data to prove that. Whereas someone who's more inclined to that idea, whether it be from their own personal bias or they're just higher risk tolerance, they're going to use the supporting data to tell you that. And so until things are definitively proven, I think people are going to behave as people have always done and just default onto their own,
Yeah.
opinions, biases, and risk tolerances.
That's right. That's
Well,
right.
Triton, I think we're gonna cut it off. I know it's late down there. You're
Oh yeah.
probably super tired, and yeah, I
Yeah.
don't want to take more of your time. We are truly grateful for having you here. It was amazing. Like we learned so much, and I feel like it was a great episode. One more for the books, and I thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
That's
so much for
right.
having me. It was great talking to you guys. And I'm gonna like tell my friends, tell people I know about this podcast now. So
Man, thank you very much. And Triton, last question to close the episode. If the whole world is listening to you right now, what would be your message?
my message is the same thing I told you on Friday. Find your purpose, do what makes you happy, and then you'll probably have a good life.
Awesome.
The,
Thank you,
awesome.
Tristan.
The best way to close this episode, that was it. Ideas Divinas with Triton. And yeah, let's get it.
Let's get it. See ya.